He was on his knees, 2,740 meters up a mountain in Zacatecas, brushing dust off a piece of limestone that should not have had an edge like that. 3 meters of sediment sat above it. The lab came back with a number nobody wanted, around 30,000 years. The textbook said 13,000. The ice corridor did not exist yet. Nobody was supposed to be standing in that cave. And the fight that followed was never really about the date. It was about who is allowed to move the line. And Chiquihuite was not even the strangest thing they found. Start with the cave itself, because the cave is wrong. Chiquihuite sits high in the Ardelean mountains in the dry heart of northern Mexico. It is cold. It is hard to reach. The roof sheds rock. There is no river below it, no obvious reason for anyone to climb that far and sleep there. Archaeologists had walked past mountains like that for a century without bothering. Cyprian Ardelean bothered. Between 2012 and 2017, his team cut down through the floor of that cave. Not a shallow test pit. 3 meters, layer after layer of sediment that had been sitting undisturbed since before the last ice age reached its peak. And out of that sediment came stone, around 1,900 pieces of it, flakes, blades, points, some of it that strange greenish limestone that does not match the cave walls in an obvious way. Not one lucky rock, not two, almost 2,000 pieces, concentrated in the parts of the cave where people would actually have sat, worked, and slept. Here's the thing about a stone tool. It is not a fossil, it is not a bone, it is an object that only exists because a hand decided it should exist. Somebody sat in the cold and struck one rock against another with intention, and the result outlived every soft thing about them. The tool outlived the hand. But the artifacts were not even the most dangerous part of that excavation. The sediment was, because sediment can be dated, and they sent it out to be dated. Then they sent it out again, radiocarbon on charcoal and organic material. Optically stimulated luminescence on the sediment grains themselves, which measures the last time those grains saw daylight. Then a Bayesian model to tie the whole sequence together layer by layer so the dates had to agree with the physical order of the deposits. The deepest layers came back around 31 to 33,000 years ago. Sit with that number for a second because you need to understand what it does. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on one story, and it was clean. Humans crossed from Siberia at the end of the Ice Age. They came down through an ice-free corridor that opened between the melting glaciers. They arrived around 13,000 years ago. They made a beautiful fluted stone spear point called Clovis, and that was the beginning. First Americans, first everything. Clovis first. Anything older was a mistake, a geofact, a misread layer, contamination. At 30,000 years ago, that corridor was not open. It was ice. The glaciers were closing, not parting. The road that the entire founding story depended on did not exist yet. So either the dates were wrong or the story was. The team ran the samples again. Same answer. They ran them again. Same answer. That was the problem. The dates would not misbehave. They would not scatter. They stacked in the right order, deep to shallow, exactly the way honest stratigraphy is supposed to stack. Nature published it in July 2020, and on the very same day, Nature published a second paper, Becerra Valdivia and Hayam, that remodeled the dating from dozens of sites across North America and Beringia, and argued that people were on the continent before the peak of the last ice age. This was not one rogue cave shouting into the wind. It was a rereading of the record. Then the field turned around. The response, when it came, was not gentle. In 2021, a group of very serious archaeologists, chatters, and a long list of co-authors in the journal PaleoAmerica went at Chiquihuite with everything. And I want to be honest with you here, because this is where cheap channels lie to you, and I am not going to. Their objections were real. They pointed out that there were no hearths, no fireplaces, no burned bone, no butchered animals, no cut marks, no human DNA in the sediment, even though the team looked. And the stone tools themselves did not look like anything. No recognizable style, no diagnostic form that says a human tradition made this. And then the killer. Chiquihuite is a limestone cave. Limestone caves manufacture sharp-edged flakes on their own. The roof cracks and falls and shatters, and rocks hit rocks, and you get pieces with edges. Nature can fake a tool. That is a legitimate scientific argument. If you cannot rule out the cave making its own tools, you do not have a site. You have a rockfall. Ardelean answered in 2022. He pointed at the recurring shapes, at forms that repeat in ways. Random breakage does not repeat, at where the pieces cluster, at the absence of any plausible natural mechanism that would produce that particular assemblage in that particular spot. The debate is still open. Nobody has closed it. But watch what happened around the argument. Ardelean has spoken publicly about the hostility, about what it costs to be a Mexican archaeologist who walks into the world's biggest journal holding a number that big. He was not just proposing a date. He was standing in front of 80 years of professional certainty and saying, your map has a hole in it, and if Chiquihuite were the only site like this, it would already be dead, buried in footnotes, filed under interesting, unproven. It is not the only site, and the field has done this before. Go to Chile, Monte Verde, a waterlogged peat bog in the south, excavated by Tom Dillehay starting in the 1970s. Peat does something almost nothing else in archaeology does. It seals out oxygen, and it preserves the soft things, the things that always rot. So Monte Verde did not give up stone. It gave up wood, hide, cordage, wooden stakes, chewed seaweed still holding its chemistry, the remains of shelters, plants carried in from the coast dozens of kilometers away, which means these people had a map in their heads, and a footprint pressed into clay, small, left by someone who was standing there. The date was around 14,500 years ago, 1,500 years before Clovis, in Chile, at the far southern end of the hemisphere, which means if you take it seriously, people had already walked the length of 2 continents before the first Americans were supposed to have arrived. The field did not take it seriously, not for about 20 years. Dillehay was accused of misreading the stratigraphy, of dating the wrong material, of over-interpreting sticks. He spent 2 decades of a working scientific life defending a peat bog. In 1997, a panel of the most senior skeptics in the discipline flew to Chile to see it for themselves. They stood in the trench and they conceded. That should have been the end of the war. It was not. The sniping resumed almost immediately afterward. And here is the part that matters, the part that tells you what kind of story this really is. Clovis first did not die honestly. There was no reckoning. There was no public apology to Dillehay. The model simply began to soften, and quietly, everyone started saying they had never really been that committed to it anyway. The wall moved, and a new wall was built behind it at roughly 16,000 years. That is the wall Chiquihuite ran into. Now come north. Pennsylvania, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. James Adovasio started digging there in 1973. And Meadowcroft is, technically, gorgeous. One of the cleanest, most carefully documented stratigraphic sequences ever excavated in North America. Layer on layer on layer, undisturbed, going down. And the deep layers gave dates pressing past 16,000 years. The response was one word. You are going to hear this word again, so remember it. Contamination. The critics said the rock shelter sat near coal deposits. Ancient carbon from that coal, they argued, could have seeped into the samples through groundwater and made everything look older than it was. Dead carbon poisoning the dates. It was not a stupid objection. It was, in fact, a good one. Adovasio spent the rest of his career answering it, sample by sample, test by test, decade by decade, watching a discipline treat his life's work as a lab error. He was not defending a number, he was defending the right of the ground to disagree with the textbook. And notice the pattern forming. Same accusation, different site, different continent sometimes. The evidence changes, the word does not. Contamination. Oregon. The Paisley Caves. Dennis Jenkins's team pulled human coprolites, ancient human waste preserved by desert dryness, out of layers dating to around 14,300 years ago. And in that material, human mitochondrial DNA. The response? The DNA leached down, Younger people urinated in the cave, the argument went, and modern molecules trickled through the sediment into older deposits and made ancient garbage look human. Again, not a crazy objection. Molecules do move, but then the same deposits gave up something molecules cannot fake. Stone points, Western stemmed points. A completely different technology from Clovis, not an ancestor of Clovis, not a descendant of it, a separate tradition, contemporary or older, made by people working from a different toolkit entirely. That is not one wave. That is not one people. That is a hemisphere that was already complicated before the first Americans were supposed to have set foot on it. One site is an error, 2 sites is a coincidence. 3 sites, all attacked with the same word, starts to look less like scientific caution and more like a reflex. But you can argue about molecules forever. Molecules are invisible, flakes are debatable, layers can be questioned. You cannot argue with a footprint the same way. White Sands, New Mexico, the Tularosa Basin, a dried lake bed of white gypsum sand on a military missile range where the ground preserves something almost unbearable to look at. Footprints, not one. Trails of them, teenagers, children, small feet running, and one sequence where a person carried a toddler across the mud, set the child down, picked them back up, and kept walking, and you can see the child's prints appear and disappear where the adult's stride shortens under the weight, and walking across the same mud flat, in the same layers, mammoth, giant ground sloth, dire wolf, they were there together, sharing a shoreline. In 2021, in Science, researchers dated seeds sealed in the print layers, Ruppia, ditch grass. The result came back between roughly 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. The peak of the last ice age, with people standing on it. The criticism arrived fast, and once again, it was reasonable. Ruppia is an aquatic plant. Aquatic plants can absorb old dissolved carbon from the water they grow in, which makes them read older than they are. The hard water effect. It is a genuine problem in radiocarbon dating, and every good geochronologist knows it. So the team went back and dated the prints 2 more ways. Terrestrial pine pollen, which grows in air, not water, immune to the hard water problem, and optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the sediment itself, which does not care about carbon at all. 2 completely independent methods, published in 2023. Same window, same answer, again. The footprint lasted longer than the person who made it, longer than the mammoth walking beside her, and longer than the theory that said she could not possibly exist. 23,000 years in New Mexico, 33,000 in Zacatecas. Suddenly, the gap between them is not an absurdity. It is a distance. It's a plausible amount of time for a population to move. And then Brazil, Santa Helena in Mato Grosso. In 2023, researchers published something that is very hard to explain away. Osteoderms, the bony plates from the armored shell of a glyptodont, an extinct beast the size of a car. And these plates had been worked, polished, perforated, modified into ornaments by hands in a way falling rocks do not do. Around 27,000 years old, Chiquihuite was no longer alone at the peak of the Ice Age. It had company on another continent, 4,000 kilometers away. Now I have to take you somewhere darker, and I have to be extremely careful about how I do it, because this next site is not evidence. It is a warning. Hueyatlaco, Puebla, Mexico. In the 1960s and the 70s, a geologist named Virginia Steen McIntyre worked on dating the volcanic ash layers around stone artifacts found at that site. The numbers her team's methods produced were around 250,000 years old. That is not a challenge to the timeline. That is a demolition of it. It would put toolmakers in Mexico before anatomically modern humans are thought to exist anywhere. Almost nobody accepted it. Almost nobody accepts it now. I do not accept it. The archaeological objections are strong, the geological reinterpretations are strong, and I'm not going to sell you a fringe date as a fact. But that is not why Hueyatlaco is in this story. Steen McIntyre has spoken openly for decades about what happened to her afterward, about what defending those numbers did to her career and her standing in the field. She has described it as a professional destruction, and she's never really been let back in. The date is rejected, the lesson was learned anyway, Every geologist and archaeologist working in Mexico after that watched what happened. They learned exactly what a number that is too big costs the person carrying it. So when a Mexican archaeologist stood up in 2020 holding 33,000 years, he knew. He knew before he published. He knew what the field does. He published anyway. This is not a conspiracy. There's no committee. Nobody burned a file. Something more ordinary is happening. And it is more durable than a conspiracy because it never has to be organized. Look at the ice-free corridor for a second, the road at the center of the whole official story. Over the last decade, teams have modeled and dated that corridor properly. When did it actually open? When did it become passable? And the answer, from sediment cores, from ancient DNA in lake beds, from plant and animal remains, is that the corridor was biologically dead for a long time after the ice began to part. No trees, no grazing herds, nothing to eat, nothing to burn. Estimates put a viable, survivable passage at something like 12,600 years ago, which is after Clovis. Read that again. The road that the founding story required could not have delivered the founding population. Even under the old model, the corridor arrives too late. The clean version had a hole in the middle of it the entire time. And it was defended anyway, aggressively, for decades, against anyone who brought back an inconvenient date. So how did they get here? The answer had been sitting on the table since 1979, when a Canadian archaeologist named Knut Fladmark proposed that people came down the Pacific coast, not through the ice, around it, along the shoreline by boat, moving between refuges where the glaciers met the sea. He was largely brushed aside for a generation. Later, John Erlandson and others gave it a name that stuck, the Kelp Highway. Kelp forests running down the entire Pacific Rim, a continuous ribbon of food. Fish, seals, shellfish, birds, a coastline you could eat your way along with a boat and a reason to keep going. And here is the part that should make your stomach drop. At the peak of the Ice Age, sea level was around 120 meters lower than it is today. Every camp they made, every hearth, every beach, every shell midden, every abandoned tool, every burial on that route is now under the ocean. Drowned, scoured, buried in marine sediment, sitting on a continental shelf nobody was excavating, because archaeologists dig on land. For 40 years, the field said there is no evidence for a coastal migration. But there is no evidence, and the evidence is underwater are not the same sentence. They were treated as the same sentence, and that is not caution. That is a failure of imagination that got promoted to a scientific position. And there are pieces of the coastal story that survived because they sat just high enough. Arlington Springs Man, human remains from Santa Rosa Island off California, around 13,000 years old. Santa Rosa was an island then too, part of a larger landmass, but still separated from the mainland by open water. You cannot walk there. Somebody had a boat. Cedros Island off Baja California adds more of the same. People on the water, working the coast, moving between land and sea in a way the walking across a corridor model never accounted for. Which brings us to the edge of the argument, and I am going to mark this clearly so you know exactly where you are standing. In 2017, Nature published a claim about a site in San Diego, the Cerruti Mastodon. Broken mastodon bones were found during highway construction, alongside large stones the authors argued were hammerstones and anvils. The bones showed spiral fractures. The claimed age, 130,000 years. Almost nobody accepts it. The site was exposed by heavy machinery. There are no stone tools of recognizable type. There are no human remains. Construction equipment breaks bones. The simplest explanation is the boring one, and most archaeologists take it. I am not defending Cerruti. I do not think you should either. But I want you to notice what its existence does. Once the timeline started moving, once 13,000 became 16, and 16 became 23, and 23 became 33, the argument lost its comfortable edge. There was no longer an obvious wall to put the crazy claims behind, and that instability is real, even when the individual claim is not. Now the irony, and this one is uncomfortable. Some of the archaeologists arguing hardest against Chiquihuite today are the same people who helped break Clovis first. Lauren Davis, who published a pre-Clovis site at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, was among the co-authors of the critique. These are not gatekeepers protecting a fortress. Many of them tore a fortress down. And that is the whole tragedy of it, and the reason this is not a conspiracy story. The field got humiliated. It spent decades attacking Monte Verde and lost. It has also been burned, badly, by bad sites, faked artifacts, and dates that fell apart under scrutiny. So it built new defenses. It set the bar high. And once you have been embarrassed once, the safest career move is to be the person who is skeptical of everything. Certainty. Protecting itself does not require a villain. It only requires people who are afraid of being wrong in public. And then genetics walked into the room and disagreed with everybody. Because here's the hard part, the part that no honest version of this story is allowed to skip. Ancient DNA does not support 30,000 years. The genome of the ancient Beringian child from Upward Sun River in Alaska, ancient and modern Native American genomes sequenced by the hundreds. They all converge on the same picture, a founding population, isolated somewhere in Beringia, diversifying and then spreading south somewhere around 16 to 20,000 years ago. Not 30, not 33. So if people really were sitting in that cave in Zacatecas at 30,000 years ago, then those people left no descendants, none. Not a trace in any living person. They came, they lived, they napped stone in the cold at 2,740 meters, and they ended. A ghost population, a branch of humanity that reached a continent and then simply stopped. That's not a comfortable answer. It is not even a clean answer. Archaeology is pointing one way, and genetics is pointing another, and neither one is lying. And genetics has its own ghost, which nobody has explained. Some Amazonian groups carry a faint, stubborn genetic signal that looks Australasian, related distantly to populations in Australia and New Guinea. Researchers have called it Population Y. It has been replicated. It has not been explained. The family tree refuses to stay neat. So, where does that leave us, honestly? Established, pre-Clovis is real. That war is over. Monte Verde is real. Paisley is real. The White Sands footprints have been dated 3 ways, and they are the strongest evidence we have that people were standing in North America during the last glacial maximum. Contested. Chiquihuite. Santa Elena. The interpretation, not the objects. The stones exist. What they mean is the fight. Speculation. Ceruti. Hueyatlaco. Lost populations. Ghost branches. I am not telling you the stones from that cave are tools. They might be rocks. The critics may turn out to be right, and if they are, Ardelean will have spent years of his life defending a rockfall. But that is not the thing that keeps me up. Here's the thing. The last time the field was this certain, it was wrong. Wrong for 20 years. It attacked a man in Chile until a delegation had to stand in his trench and admit it. And when it lost, nobody apologized. There was no retraction. There was no reckoning. The textbooks just changed a sentence. The museum labels got 1 word softer. The maps grew a new arrow along the coast. The retreat happened in footnotes, in cautious rewording, in a slow, quiet edit that let everyone pretend the fight had never been brutal. And the people who spent their careers being called reckless were never made whole. So picture 2 places. A cave mouth at 2,740 meters in the Ardelean Mountains, cold air moving through it, 3 meters of sediment that took 5 years to dig, and a few hundred bagged limestone flakes sitting in a lab in Zacatecas, waiting for a verdict that may never come. And then the other archive, the one that actually matters, 120 meters down off the Pacific coast, thousands of kilometers of drowned shoreline where the first people almost certainly walked, camped, ate, and died. Nobody has looked there. We built an entire story about the peopling of a hemisphere out of the evidence that happened to stay dry, and then we defended it like it was the whole map.